Have you ever stopped to think that one of the greatest civilizations in history only existed because of something as simple as river mud? Strange, isn't it? While everyone marvels at pyramids, pharaohs, and golden temples, the truth is that none of this would have been possible without the nearly invisible labor of farmers on the banks of the Nile. Egypt wasn't born of powerful kings, it was born of calloused hands, digging the earth under a scorching sun. And here's the controversial part: the Egyptian farmer was both the pillar and the anonymous. Without him, there was no bread, no beer, no army. But ironically, almost no one remembers his name. It's as if history has chosen to celebrate only the monuments, forgetting the foundation that truly sustained the empire. The paradox is that for those people, depending on the Nile meant living between plenty and misery. A year of abundant flooding meant feasts, full reserves, and prosperity. A year of weak flooding meant hunger, revolt, and fear. And this is where the question arises: how did a simple farmer cope with this roller coaster between hope and despair? What you're about to discover isn't found in textbooks. We'll delve into the daily lives of these men and women, understanding their rituals, their fears, their strategies, and even how they found moments of joy amidst their exhausting routine. Prepare yourself. This isn't the romanticized version of Egypt, but real life, boring, slow, and full of repetition, exactly as they lived it. And before we dive into this story, let me ask you, where are you watching from now? And what time is it there? I want to see in the comments how far this Nile story is going. They say the Nile was not just a river, but the very heartbeat of all Egypt. Each year, it overflowed in an almost ritualistic fashion, bringing with it not only water, but also a fertile layer of black silt capable of transforming an arid desert into a bountiful field. Imagine for a moment a farmer watching the water level rise, knowing that the abundance of his family and an entire civilization depended on it. It wasn't just nature, it was a silent pact between man and the river. And here's a curious detail: without this flood, Egypt simply wouldn't have become the powerhouse we know in history. Think about it. How many civilizations had land but didn't have a river that almost magically fertilized the soil every year? It was as if the Nile were an invisible partner to the farmers, one who never failed to show up, but also demanded respect and patience. After all, there were years when the flood was less intense, and the fear of scarcity lingered in the air. The black mud left by the flood even had a name. It was called Kemet, and it was so valuable that it gave rise to Egypt's very name, the Black Land. Without it, the soil would be nothing but barren sand. It's interesting to note how something so simple, a layer of dark earth, could determine whether a people would prosper or starve. How often do we underestimate the small details that, when added together, sustain our entire life? It's like that routine that seems banal, but which is what guarantees the future. Now look how curious. This dependence on the Nile created a sense of humility. The farmer knew that, no matter how hard he worked, there would always be a part of the process beyond his control. And herein lies a great lesson. We often want to dominate everything, but life shows us that there are non-negotiable factors, such as time, chance, or even nature itself. The farmer understood that his role was to cooperate, not fight against it. And deep down, isn't that the same experience we experience when we realize we need to surf the tides of life rather than resist them? And so, each flood brought with it not only nourishment for the body, but also a reminder for the soul that prosperity is born of patience, waiting, and trust in something greater than ourselves. And of course, when the water receded, the real work began, preparing the soil, planting, but that's another part of the story, linked to the simple tools that shaped that daily life. When one thinks of agriculture in ancient Egypt, it's easy to imagine grand inventions or sophisticated tools, but in reality, the farmer had something extremely simple in his hands. The wooden hoe, it didn't have an iron blade, it didn't have a metallic sheen, but it was what connected man to the earth. With each blow to the soil, it wasn't just the wood that wore down, but also the muscles of those who wielded it day after day. This rudimentary hoe became almost an extension of his own body. The farmer knew it so well that he could tell by its weight and the sound of its impact whether the soil was too wet or too dry. Interestingly, the tool's simplicity was the key to its effectiveness. Perhaps this makes us think about modern life. How often do we seek sophisticated solutions when in reality, a wooden hoe would solve the problem? And there was an interesting detail. Fragile as it seemed, the hoe held the power to sustain entire families. It was with it that the black earth left by the Nile floods was turned, preparing it to receive wheat and barley seed. Just imagine a simple piece of wood determining whether there would be bread and beer on the community's table. It's as if an old cell phone today, even without cutting edge features, could still ensure someone could work and survive. Tool wear was inevitable. From time to time, the farmer needed to replace the tip, reinforce the handle, or even improvise with ropes to make it last another season. This also revealed the spirit of resilience of those people. Nothing was thrown away, always seeking to repair it. And deep down, isn't this the same mentality we need to recapture in a world where rapid consumption makes us forget the value of maintenance? Watching the farmer at work, one notices that it wasn't just physical strength, but also rhythm. The rhythmic, repetitive movement almost became a kind of silent prayer. Each blow to the earth seemed like a reminder that patience builds the future. It's a bit like a student who reviews a subject 1,000 times, or a worker who repeats the same gesture in his job until suddenly the fruits appear. And it was at this pace that the field took shape. The hoe was not just an object, but a symbol of perseverance. With it, each grain had a chance to grow. And of course, not just anything was planted. Specific, hand-picked crops sustained Egypt's entire food supply. But this brings us to another essential point in this story, the seeds that truly gave meaning to all this effort. In the heart of ancient Egypt, wheat and barley weren't just plants, they were the very foundation of life. Without them, there would be no fresh bread on the tables, nor beer, which was practically a liquid food. Planting these grains was more than a routine, it was a ritual repeated year after year, as if the future depended on each seed sown into the earth. And in a way, it did. The farmer knew that by scattering the grain, he was sowing much more than food. He was providing energy for construction workers, strength for soldiers, and even peace of mind for families. After all, without bread, the mood of an entire people would change. It's curious to note how, even today, certain foods still dictate the mood of a home. All it takes is a lack of rice or coffee for the day to feel incomplete. Wheat was used for finer bread, consumed primarily by the elite, while barley was often used to make beer, a popular drink among all classes. It's interesting to consider how even here there was a social divide. What grew side by side in the fields ended up having very different fates. It's almost like today's market, where two similar products can be sold at completely opposite prices, depending on the packaging and the consumer. The planting process required synchronization with the Nile's waters. The farmer had to wait for the floodwaters to recede and for the soil to reach the right level, neither too wet nor too dry. It was an exercise in patience and observation. Today, we can associate this with the right time to invest, change careers, or even start a personal project. Planting too early can be risky. Planting too late can mean missing an opportunity. And there was also the collective factor. Families often helped each other with planting, knowing that a bountiful harvest was beneficial to all. Abundance wasn't limited to a single person, but sustained entire communities. It's like when a neighbor shares seedlings or when coworkers exchange valuable information. One person's success strengthens the group. Thus, each row of wheat and barley grew as a reminder that survival was directly linked to the land. The farmer looked at the golden fields and saw in them the reflection of his own hope. But after the harvest, a new concern arose: how to transform this effort into something lasting, something that could withstand the test of time and daily consumption. This is where storage comes in, a detail as simple as it is vital. If wheat and barley sustained the body, flax was what shaped the identity of ancient Egypt. It was from this fabric that clothing, blankets, ritual fabrics, and even the bandages that wrapped mummies emerged. Cultivating flax was not only a matter of practical necessity, but also of status and spirituality. Those who mastered this process gained not only fiber, but also prestige. When the farmer planted flax, he knew he wasn't dealing with just any crop. It required care, attention, and patience, as the fibers needed to be strong and resilient. It was almost like preparing a gift for the gods, as the fabrics held enormous value in religious ceremonies. Interestingly, to this day, we associate clothing with much more than protection. It communicates who we are, where we are, and even how we want to be seen. After harvesting came the laborious process of removing the fibers, drying them, and preparing them for weaving. This wasn't a task for a single person, but a collective effort involving entire families. Imagine the calloused hands working together while conversations, stories, and even songs filled the air. This routine reminded us that behind every fabric lay sweat, patience, and tradition. Linen also played a significant economic role. It served as a currency in trade and as an export product. Think of it as Egypt's trademark, just as certain countries today are remembered for their coffee, wine, or oil. Egypt was recognized for the quality of its fabrics. This reputation crossed borders and reinforced the image of a sophisticated and prosperous people. It's interesting to note how linen was present across all social classes, albeit in varying qualities. The richest wore fine, white, and lightweight clothing, while the poorest wore rougher, simpler fabrics. This distinction was a reflection of power. Essentially, it's the same logic we see today when someone sports a designer outfit while another wears something basic. Both are dressed, but the symbolism is quite different. And of course, flax cultivation wasn't limited to simply clothing the body. It was part of a larger cycle in which the farmer realized that everything the land offered had multiple purposes. After tending to the crops and the fiber, the only thing left to consider was who would bring this fabric to life. The women, who patiently wove, transforming thread into history. And it is precisely here that the role of women in agriculture comes to the fore. While many eyes were focused on the men's work plowing and sowing, there was a silent but crucial step that fell to the women: the gathering and drying of the grain. It was meticulous work, done with almost infinite patience, where each handful of grain represented days of effort. Without this care, the entire process could simply be lost. Women with steady hands and keen eyes knew how to distinguish good grain from those that wouldn't survive storage. This selection seemed trivial, but it was what ensured fresh bread on the table months later. Interestingly, this role still resonates today. How often are they the ones who notice details at home, at work, or in the family that would go unnoticed by others? It's as if the instinct to care was engraved in every gesture. Once harvested, the grains needed to be dried in the sun, on large mats or makeshift patios. There, as the wind blew, moments of sharing arose. Conversations, laughter, and even songs accompanied the process. An arduous task was transformed into a kind of community gathering where not only food was cultivated, but also bonds were forged. It's a bit like preparing a family recipe. The food may be simple, but the flavor of shared memories makes it special. Women's work in agriculture wasn't recognized with grand titles or official records, but it was indispensable. It was in the hands of these women that the harvest gained longevity. Without them, grain reserves could rot, mold, or simply be insufficient to feed everyone. It's curious how, throughout history, the essential has so often been hidden in the shadow of the invisible. Furthermore, there was an educational aspect to this process. Mothers took their daughters to learn from an early age how to handle grains, perpetuating ancestral knowledge. It was a practical inheritance passed down through daily life that shaped generations. Today, we can compare this habit to teaching small household chores, such as sewing on a button, preparing a meal, or organizing finances, details that support the whole. And when the grains were finally ready for storage, there was still another crucial step: storage in clay silos, a technique that, although simple, carried the wisdom of protecting the future in times of abundance. And of course, this leads us directly to reflect on how Egypt managed its reserves, always with an eye on the future. After harvesting and careful drying came one of the most strategic moments of agricultural life in ancient Egypt: storing the grain. To do this, farmers used clay silos, seemingly simple structures that represented the difference between plenty and famine. They were like nature's vaults, where each grain became a currency for the future. Silos were built with thick walls capable of maintaining a stable temperature and protecting against moisture. But the most important detail was the seal. A single crack was enough for insects or rodents to destroy entire months of work. It's curious to think how, even today, our lives depend so much on protection against small breaches, whether in finances, relationships, or even health. The farmer deposited the grain with almost a ritual, knowing that from it would come bread and beer throughout the year. In times of abundance, the silos overflowed, and the community breathed a sigh of relief. In difficult years, however, each handful removed was carefully counted. This awareness of limits reminds us how we often forget to value enough, always yearning for more. There was also strict state control. Scribes recorded how much was stored, ensuring that taxes were paid and that royal reserves were safe. In other words, even grain that appeared to belong to the farmer was ultimately tied to the government. This dynamic is not so far removed from modern reality, where we work hard, but a portion of the harvest always goes to taxes or fees. The clay silo was not just a physical structure, but a symbol of planning. It showed that survival depended not only on planting and harvesting, but also on thinking about tomorrow. How many times in our own lives have we failed to reap the rewards, but failed to save them, whether it's a lack of financial savings or neglect of healthy habits? Waste always exacts a high price, and so, protected inside the silos, the grains awaited their moment to become food. But the farmer knew that storage wasn't enough. He also needed to be accountable, and those who oversaw this process, ensuring that nothing was lost or misappropriated, were figures carrying quills and papyrus, the scribe. In ancient Egypt, it wasn't enough to plant, harvest, and store crops. Farmers knew that part of the fruits of their labor would find another destination, the state coffers. Taxes were paid not in shiny coins, but in sacks of grain, jugs of beer, or even fabrics. It was as if the government were a big neighbor who always knocked on the door at the end of the harvest, demanding its share. These taxes were mandatory and often heavy. Scribes were responsible for overseeing them, attentive to every measure. They recorded on papyrus what was due, and there was no room for excuses. If the harvest was plentiful, the tax increased. If it was scarce, the farmer still had to give a portion of what little he had. It's curious to note how this cycle still echoes in our lives. The more we produce, the more taxes seem to reach us. Payment in kind had a clear symbolism. It showed that the farmer did not own his harvest entirely. He was part of a larger system, his produce supporting soldiers, artisans, scribes, and of course, royalty. It was a reminder that no one prospered alone. This idea resonates strongly with the present. In any society, we all contribute in one way or another to sustaining the collective structure. But there was also a side of dissatisfaction. Many farmers felt the burden of handing over part of their harvest, especially in difficult years. Imagine working for months on end, facing scorching sun, and still having to give up part of what should feed your family. It's the same feeling many people feel today when they see part of their salary go straight to deductions and taxes without having a choice. This tax system, harsh as it was, helped finance major projects like temples and pyramids. Each brick indirectly reflected the efforts of farmers who, even without being on the construction site, contributed to the construction of Egypt's grandeur. It's a reminder that great achievements are almost always supported by the invisible sacrifice of many. And as the farmer handed over his share to the collectors, he knew he was still being watched. Control didn't stop with the tax. It was also necessary to ensure that the remaining harvest was used responsibly. Scribes performed this role, attentive, almost like shadows, following each step of the process. In ancient Egypt, scribes were much more than just men with papyrus and pen in hand. They represented the eyes of the state, monitoring every detail of agricultural production. The farmer might sweat, plant, harvest, and even store, but ultimately the one who determined the value of all that effort was the scribe. He wrote down, calculated, and recorded as if each grain were a line in a vast national ledger. These men commanded immense prestige because they mastered writing, something inaccessible to most. Imagine the feeling of standing before someone who, with a stroke of ink, determined whether your family would have a little more or a little less to survive. It was a mixture of respect and fear. Basically, it was like dealing with a tax auditor today. No matter how hard we work, they have the power to determine whether everything is in order or not. The presence of scribes brought discipline to the fields. They ensured that taxes were paid correctly and that nothing escaped the pharaoh's control. But at the same time, they left the farmer in a vulnerable position. After all, how could you challenge someone who mastered writing when most couldn't even read? It was like trying to discuss a contract full of fine print without ever having studied law. Despite the burden, there was a positive side. Scribes' careful record keeping allowed Egypt to organize reserves, avoid waste, and plan for the future. Thanks to them, the state knew how much grain was available in times of plenty and how much would need to be rationed in times of scarcity. Interestingly, even amidst rigid control, there existed an administrative intelligence that sustained collective survival. The farmer, in turn, needed to learn to deal with this surveillance. Many viewed the scribes as inevitable, a natural part of the cycle, like the flooding of the Nile or the scorching sun. Perhaps there's even a lesson here. We can't always escape life's inspections, but we can learn to live with them and even take advantage of them, transforming control into plan. And while the scribe recorded the quantity of grain and cloth, the farmer was already thinking about the next step. After all, the work didn't stop there. The fields required strength, but also the help of four-legged companions. And that's precisely where animals come in, silent allies in working the land. In ancient Egypt, human strength alone was not enough to tame the land. It was then that oxen and donkeys became indispensable allies in agricultural work. They pulled rustic wooden plows, opening furrows in the fertile soil left by the Nile. With this help, farmers could cultivate fields much larger than they could with their bare hands. It was a silent but vital partnership. Oxen, strong and resilient, were primarily responsible for turning the heavier earth. Donkeys, though smaller, were valuable for transportation, carrying baskets full of seeds, jugs of water, or even loads of grain. Each animal had its own defined role, like cogs in a machine. It's curious to note how, even today, we divide roles into teams according to each individual's strength and skill. Taming these animals, however, wasn't simple. They needed to be trained and cared for daily, receiving adequate food and rest. The farmer knew that if he overexploited his animals, they wouldn't endure the long workday. This balance teaches us something. Even the greatest allies need to be respected, otherwise the wear and tear will take its toll. Besides strength, the animals brought rhythm. The oxen's steady gait guided the plow almost hypnotically, while the farmer simply watched. It was repetitive work, but it resembled a dance between man and nature. Imagine yourself observing this scene. The high sun, the sound of the plow cutting through the earth, and the heavy thud of hooves marking time. A simple yet deeply symbolic spectacle. Animals also represented wealth. Owning oxen and donkeys was a sign of prosperity, as it allowed farmers to produce more and consequently save more. In a way, they were like the agricultural machines of the time, multiplying yield. Today, we can draw a direct analogy. With technology, those with access to the best tools can produce on a larger scale and more efficiently. And once the furrows were cleared, the next step came, sowing the seeds of life into the newly prepared soil. After all, it wasn't enough to simply clear the way with the help of animals. It was necessary to plant what would sustain the people. And this is where the diversity of foods came in, which went far beyond wheat and barley. Although wheat and barley were the staples of survival, the daily lives of Egyptian farmers demanded variety. Thus, vegetables and greens occupied a fundamental place in the diet. On the humid banks of the Nile, lettuce, cucumbers, onions, and garlic sprouted, seasoning and complementing meals. Each small patch was a relief from the monotony of bread and beer. The farmer knew that these foods had not only flavor, but also medicinal properties. Garlic, for example, was valued for strengthening the body, especially for workers who endured long shifts under the sun. Onions were considered so important that they were even used in offerings to the gods. It's curious to see how, even today, certain foods carry this aura of natural healing. These gardens were usually cultivated close to homes, in smaller, more controlled areas. This allowed women and children to also participate in the daily care, watering and harvesting as needed. It was an almost intimate activity that strengthened family bonds. It's like tending a small garden in the backyard. More than just providing food, it creates a routine of closeness to the land. Another interesting detail is that the Egyptians didn't just see vegetables as a dietary supplement, but also as a source of pleasure. Eating something fresh, crunchy, and full of flavor was a source of satisfaction, especially in the harsh desert. Today, when we bite into a ripe fruit or prepare a colorful salad, we may be reliving that same feeling of simple reward. Vegetable cultivation also demonstrated the skill of harnessing the Nile's resources. Irrigation canals provided the necessary water, ensuring that even in times of intense heat, the gardens remained green. This ability to transform a hostile environment into a fertile space is a powerful reminder of resilience. It's like finding creative ways to maintain balance in life amidst difficult times. And ultimately, all of this depended on a larger cycle, the timing of the floods, and the calendar that organized each stage of planting. Because it wasn't enough to simply plant and harvest, it was necessary to respect the natural order imposed by the river. And this is precisely where the importance of Nile-based calendars comes in. In ancient Egypt, the calendar was guided not only by the movement of the stars, but by the pulse of the Nile itself. Life revolved around the annual floods, which determined the right time to plant, harvest, and even rest. Every farmer knew they couldn't defy this cycle. Those who tried to plant late reaped failure. Nature dictated the rhythm, and humans merely followed suit. The Egyptians divided the year into three agricultural seasons: Ekhet, the flood season; Peret, the planting season; and Shemu, the harvest season. This organization was not only practical, but sacred. It was as if the gods had written an invisible instruction manual, and it was up to the farmer to follow it. Today, we can compare this to the school calendar or the financial market. Both also impose a rhythm that we cannot ignore. Interestingly, this agricultural calendar served as the basis for social and religious life. Festivals and rituals were held according to the changes in the river, celebrating abundance or asking for protection in years of uncertainty. The farmer didn't see time as something abstract, but as a tangible sequence of high and low tides. It's almost like measuring life not by dates, but by cycles of rain, harvest, or even the phases of the moon. The accuracy of this calendar was so great that centuries later, it inspired other civilizations. Observing the Nile was like reading a natural clock, and each watermark on the banks served as a reminder of what was to come. It's interesting to think that even without modern technology, the Egyptians developed such an efficient form of organization that it sustained centuries of prosperity. The farmer, in his daily routine, didn't need a wristwatch or a paper diary. He just needed to look at the river. If the flood hadn't yet arrived, it was time to wait. If the water receded, it was time to prepare the land. This simplicity can teach us something. Sometimes we overcomplicate life when the answer lies in the natural rhythm of things. And when the calendar showed that the flood season was over, the collective effort began. Planting and tending the fields was not a solitary task, but rather a group effort under orders from above. And it is precisely at this point that the power of collective labor on the plantations is revealed. In ancient Egypt, agriculture wasn't just a family or small community affair. Fields were often organized into large plantations under the direct orders of local rulers and administrators. Farmers then worked not just for themselves, but as part of a vast machine that supported temples, armies, and palaces. It was as if every hoe and every seed had a collective destiny. These collective efforts required discipline. Men, women, and even young people gathered in groups, each with a clearly defined role. Some plowed the land, others sowed the seeds, while still others tended the irrigation. It was a coordinated, almost military effort where unity determined success. And here there's a similarity to modern life. How many companies, projects, or even families only thrive when each person does their part. The supervisor's presence brought a dual sense of organization and pressure. The farmer knew his performance was being monitored and that deadlines were being met. At the same time, there was the comfort of not being alone, of sharing the burden with dozens of hands working around him. It's like when we face a difficult task and discover that with help, the impossible becomes possible. Besides feeding the population, these large plantations played a strategic role, securing reserves for the state, and most importantly, supporting monumental works. Each block of stone, erected in pyramids or temples, bore, behind it, the grain cultivated by anonymous farmers. It's impressive to think that Egypt's grandeur rested silently on the shoulders of these workers. And at the end of the day, as the sun set over the Nile, everyone knew there was still one more motivation to carry on. The food grown in those fields sustained not only the royalty, but also their own families. And among the most common products in this daily life were two symbols of the Egyptian table: bread and beer, the staples of everyone's diet. Wheat and barley, cultivated with so much effort, had precisely this destiny. Bread nourished the body, while beer hydrated and provided energy. Unlike the beverage we know today, Egyptian beer was thicker, almost a fermented soup, full of grains. It was consumed by everyone: men, women, and even children. It's curious to imagine that for them, drinking beer was as natural as drinking water or coffee for us. Bread, in turn, had symbolism. It was present in religious offerings, banquets, and even funeral rituals, as if it guaranteed nourishment for the afterlife. Each piece of bread was the result of a long cycle: the flooding of the Nile, work in the fields, milling, preparing the dough, and baking. It was like a summary of the farmer's own existence, transformed into food. These two elements also brought a sense of security. When there was enough bread and beer, people felt everything was in order. When there was a shortage, fear of hunger and instability arose. It's not so different today. When the refrigerator is full, we feel at peace. When it's empty, the atmosphere in the home changes completely. Essentials have always had a disproportionate power over people's mood. Beyond nourishing, bread and beer created moments of conviviality. Families gathered to eat. Workers shared their meals in the fields. And even during religious festivals, these foods played a central role. Eating and drinking together was an act of communion, of belonging. It's the same in any culture. Sharing a table is much more than just satisfying hunger. It's strengthening bonds. And of course, for bread and beer to be abundant, an essential technology was needed: irrigation. Without the canals that carried Nile water to the fields, there would be no grain. And without grain, there would be no life. And this is precisely where the Egyptians' ingenuity in building irrigation canals comes into play. Without irrigation, Egypt would be nothing more than a desert of scorching sand. It was thanks to the ingenuity of farmers that the Nile's waters spread to distant fields through hand-dug canals. Imagine men, women, and even children carrying rudimentary shovels, digging furrows that would transform the landscape. What seemed like a tiring endeavor was, in fact, the secret to keeping an entire civilization alive. These canals were carefully planned. It wasn't enough to just dig haphazardly. It was necessary to calculate the correct slope, depth, and direction so that the water reached each bed without waste. Farmers, even without modern instruments, learned to read the terrain with their. It's like someone who today knows how to install plumbing or irrigation systems instinctively without relying on engineers. The functioning of these canals depended on constant maintenance. Over time, silt and sand accumulated, requiring farmers to return to clean them. This routine of care was as important as the planning itself. After all, without running water, the seeds would dry out before they even sprouted. It's curious how this need for maintenance is repeated in our lives. It's not enough to build something, we must maintain it to keep it functioning. Besides ensuring bountiful harvests, the canals symbolize the power of community. No single farmer could dig and maintain miles of irrigation alone. It was a collaborative effort, coordinated by local leaders, requiring discipline and cooperation. This logic still resonates today. Great achievements, whether buildings, roads, or even businesses, are only possible through collective effort. Irrigation canals also had a direct impact on the economy. Thanks to them, Egypt was able to produce far more than its population needed, generating surpluses that were exchanged or stored. It's as if each canal were an invisible line of wealth, connecting the river to the future. Once again, it's clear that without organization and vision, even the Nile's gift could be wasted. And after hours of digging and maintenance under the sun, the farmer knew he deserved a break. But this rest wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. The intense heat forced everyone to seek shelter and regain strength. And it's at this point that we see how even the act of resting was part of the agricultural cycle. In ancient Egypt, the sun was not only a source of life, but also a relentless adversary. Under its scorching heat, farmers learned that endurance came not only from hard work, but also from strategic pauses. Seeking shade under a tree or beside a mud wall was almost a sacred ritual. There, the body rested, sweat dried, and energy was slowly restored. This habit demonstrated a simple wisdom. It's impossible to produce continuously without respecting the body's limits. The farmer knew that pushing himself beyond what was bearable would result in fainting, illness, and even loss of the entire harvest due to a lack of strength to complete the work. How often in modern life do we repeat the same mistake, trying to ignore the need for rest? Today, shade can be a weekend with family or even a few minutes of silence away from the hustle and bustle. Resting in the shade also had a social side. It was at this time that farmers would gather to chat, share bread and beer, or even tell stories. The break was not just physical, but emotional, strengthening bonds between neighbors and friends. It was a way to remember that, even in hard work, there was room for humanity. It's like that coffee break at the office, which seems short, but sustains everyone's sanity. Interestingly, this custom also had to do with the natural cycle of the day. The midday sun was avoided, and work was concentrated more in the early morning and late afternoon. The farmer adapted his rhythm to nature's rather than fighting it. Today, we often do the opposite, trying to impose rigid deadlines on a body that craves a break. and the result is almost always exhaustion. Furthermore, rest was also a time for contemplation. Looking out at the fields, observing the Nile in the distance, and reflecting on what still needed to be done brought clarity. This space of silence reminded the farmer that he was part of something much larger. Similarly, when we stop to breathe, we often find answers that don't come in a rush, and rising from the shade, renewed, the farmer knew he needed more than physical strength to ensure good harvests. He also needed to rely on something invisible, the blessing of the gods. And it is precisely at this point that offerings come in, made with devotion to ensure abundance. In ancient Egypt, cultivating the land was not only a physical act, but also a spiritual one. Farmers believed that without the help of the gods, no amount of effort would be enough. Therefore, before planting or after harvesting, simple offerings were made: bread, beer, flowers, or even small animals. These gestures were not seen as superstition, but as a silent dialogue with higher powers. Happy, the god of the Nile, was one of the most revered. He was prayed for abundant but non destructive waters that would fertilize the soil without devastating the fields. Imagine the farmer depositing his offerings on the riverbank, gazing at the flow of the waters as if gazing at an oracle. It was faith, but also a way of coping with the uncertainty that always surrounded agriculture. The offerings also had a collective character. Often, entire villages would gather at temples or makeshift altars, reinforcing the idea that prosperity was not an individual responsibility, but rather everyone. This sense of unity still resonates today. In times of hardship, it's common to see people joining together in prayer, community outreach, or solidarity campaigns, believing that shared strength yields better results. It's interesting to note that by offering part of his produce, the farmer didn't see it as a loss. On the contrary, he believed this act would pave the way for multiplication. It's a logic that survives today. In many cultures, giving, sharing, or giving thanks before expecting more. After all, those who don't nurture their relationship with what they consider sacred rarely feel at peace when harvesting. The time of offerings also served to soothe the heart. Amidst the harshness of the routine, stopping to give thanks or ask for help was like an emotional respite. The farmer returned to the field with the feeling that he was not alone, that there was something greater guiding his steps. And let's face it, this belief gave him strength on the heaviest days. But even with faith and devotion, reality remained demanding. The blessing of the gods was essential, but the body still had to endure long, exhausting days. And it was at this point that the physical toll of fieldwork became impossible to ignore. For the Egyptian farmer, the Nile was not just a river, it was the very incarnation of a god. Happy, the lord of the floods, was seen as the one who brought fertility to the land. Without him, there would be no harvest, no bread, no life. This belief was so deep that the river's cycles were interpreted as divine signs, as if each rise or fall of the water were a message from the sacred. Representations of Happy depicted him as a robust figure with large breasts, symbolizing abundance and prosperity. It was a curious portrait, a male god with feminine attributes, reinforcing the idea that fertility transcends gender boundaries. Farmers, looking at these images, found in them hope that the coming year would bring abundance. It's like today when we hang symbols of luck or faith in our home. The rituals honoring Happy were festive. Chants, dances, and offerings were performed on the riverbanks, praying for balance, a flood large enough to fertilize but not so intense as to destroy villages. This search for harmony reveals much of the Egyptian mentality. Prosperity depended not on excess, but on the right measure, something we still strive for in our modern lives, trying to balance work, leisure, and family. Interestingly, belief in happy also functioned as a form of acceptance. When the waters failed and the harvest was poor, the farmer saw it not simply as bad luck or human error, but as a divine message. This kind of thinking helped him cope with inevitable frustrations. After all, attributing to the sacred what could not be controlled provided emotional relief. But the devotion wasn't passive. Farmers believed that pleasing Happy increased their chances of abundance. Therefore, part of their harvest was offered in her honor. It was a pact, human labor and divine blessing, walking hand in hand. In a way, this logic still lives on in us when we give thanks before a meal or make promises in times of difficulty. And even though Happy's name was repeated with reverence, the human body felt the weight of the labor that sustained this devotion, because ultimately, belief in the god of the Nile didn't eliminate the daily fatigue, the physical strain that marked every farmer's routine. The Egyptian farmer's life was not marked by luxury or prolonged rest. His body was the true instrument of labor, shaped by the scorching sun and the exhausting repetition of movements. Entire days were spent bent over the earth, carrying baskets, guiding plows, or tending irrigation. There were no gyms, but the constant physical exertion left deep marks, visible in his arched back and calloused hands. This effort wasn't fleeting, but continuous. The farmer had no vacations, nor days off, because the agricultural cycle waited for no one. If he delayed a task, he jeopardized the entire harvest. It's like modern life, when we feel like we can't stop because the clock and demands give us no respite. Our bodies crave a break, but responsibility pushes us forward. The simple diet, bread, beer, and vegetables provided energy, but didn't eliminate fatigue. The lack of nutritional variety left the body vulnerable, and illness often struck precisely during periods of greatest exertion. Still, the farmer found strength in his faith and sense of duty. It was as if he said to himself, "If I don't plant, my family won't eat." Interestingly, physical exhaustion was also a type of silent learning. The farmer discovered his limits through practice, understanding how far he could go without collapsing. This body awareness, though painful, was part of survival. Today, we call it physical intelligence, recognizing the body's signals before it forces us to stop. But back then, stopping wasn't an option. This daily burden meant that even simple moments, like sitting in the shade or dipping one's feet in the Nile, were experienced as immense pleasures. The contrast between effort and rest gave meaning to the day. It's interesting to note how, to this day, we only fully appreciate rest after a heavy workload. It's fatigue that teaches us the value of a break. And even exhausted, the farmer still needed to think about how to transform this work into useful exchanges. Because no matter how much his family supported themselves from the fields, there were needs that could only be met through the exchange of produce for other goods. Ancient Egyptian farmers knew that, as essential as wheat or barley were, one couldn't live on bread and beer alone. They needed everyday utensils, clothing to combat the heat, or even simple objects that made life more practical. And since money wasn't yet central to the economy, direct exchange, barter was the way to transform harvests into resources. A sack of grain could become a new hoe, a pair of leather sandals, or even ceramic jars. This dynamic gave farmers the feeling that their produce had value beyond the field. It was as if each seed planted was deep down a piece of cloth, a kitchen utensil, or even a small tool. Everything was connected. Exchanges took place in local markets, spaces teeming with activity, smells, and voices. There farmers, artisans, and merchants met, each offering the best they had. Farmers would carry their baskets of grain and return home with what they needed. It's curious how this custom resonates to this day. In markets, in exchanges of services between friends, or even in barter groups that endure in the modern world. More than just meeting needs, bartering also strengthened social bonds. The act of exchanging was not only economic, but also relational. The farmer knew who was trustworthy, who had good parts, and who could cheat him. It was a negotiation that went beyond the product, involving trust and reputation. The same is true today when we choose who to do business with, not only based on price, but also on trust in the partner. This exchange also revealed the diversity of human needs. The farmer could plant crops, but not manufacture cloth. He could harvest vegetables, but not produce clay jars. Barter showed that no one was self sufficient, that everyone depended on one another, and this interdependence sustained life in society, making every profession essential. And when the cycle of exchanges ended, the farmer returned home not only with what he needed, but also with a sense of belonging to something greater. And he knew that if the harvest was good, there would be room to celebrate, share, and give thanks with the community, because that was how post harvest celebrations were born. These moments held profound spiritual value. Celebrations were not just about material abundance, but also about thanking the gods for the protection and fertility of the land. Every song sung, every improvised dance, was a moving offering. It's like when today, amid personal or professional achievements, we make a point of sharing with friends, transforming the result into a collective celebration. The festivals were also a way to renew social bonds. There, neighbors exchanged stories, young people met potential partners, and families strengthened their sense of belonging. Working in the fields brought people together, but it was in celebration that bonds were truly strengthened. After all, those who share the hardships of effort know how to appreciate the lightness of joy. Food, at these gatherings, was a symbol of victory. Eating and drinking together was a sign that the worst was over, that the risk of famine was farther away, and the more abundant the feast, the more confidence in the future was strengthened. This gesture reminds us that to this day, celebrating with food is a universal act of gratitude and hope. Interestingly, these festivals also had a practical function. They marked the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. It was a time to take a deep breath, to renew strength for the next plants. The farmer knew the joy wouldn't last forever, but he understood that he needed this break to move forward. It's like an extended holiday in our modern calendar, a necessary break to get back to routine. And when the last torches were extinguished and silence returned to the banks of the Nile, one thing remained certain. The cycle would not always be so generous. There were years when the flood didn't bring what was expected, and abundance gave way to scarcity. And it was during these periods that the farmer discovered the harsh reality of droughts and weak floods. The Nile didn't fulfill its promise of fertility every year. There were periods when the floods were too weak, unable to carry enough water to the fields. Farmers would then see their crops wither in the parched earth, and fear of famine gripped families. This was the cruel side of dependence on the river. Abundance and scarcity came from the same source. In times of drought, The impact went far beyond the table. Egypt's entire economy felt the weight of scarcity. Bread and beer became more expensive, taxes continued to be levied, and in some cases, entire communities had to resort to state reserves. It was as if all collective effort collapsed in the face of a single variable, the force of the waters. The weak flood also brought social instability. Families began to worry about the future. Some resorted to grain loans, and others had to sell part of their land. Inequality increased as those with more reserves were able to survive, while the poorest were forced to depend on the generosity of neighbors or the state. A situation not so different from what we see today in economic crises. In addition to hunger, the people's morale was shaken. Many interpreted the lack of flooding as a sign of the gods' displeasure. Rituals and offerings intensified in an attempt to reverse the situation. The farmer, tired and anxious, sought in the sacred an explanation for what was beyond his control. After all, in times of uncertainty, faith became an anchor to endure fear. These difficult periods left their mark on the collective memory. Entire generations remembered droughts and passed down stories of suffering as warnings for the future. This wisdom helped reinforce the importance of storage and planning, reminding us that the river would not always be generous. It was a harsh but necessary lesson. Prosperity should never be taken for granted. And precisely to address this fragility, farmers sought to diversify their production. They didn't rely solely on wheat or barley, but also on other food sources that held up better. Among them was a special tree that offered sweetness in the middle of the desert, the date palm. Amidst the fertile banks of the Nile, date palms stood like silent guardians of the desert. From them grew dates, sweet and nutritious fruits that supplemented the diet of Egyptian farmers. Caring for these trees was not simple. It required patience, specific techniques, and constant attention to ensure the clusters ripened properly. It was a long-term effort, but one that rewarded abundantly. Dates weren't just used to sweeten life, they were a source of energy on days of intense exertion, kept for longer, and were easily transported, making them a strategic resource for travel or times of scarcity. The farmer understood that by caring for the palm tree, he was cultivating a reserve of resilience. It's like when today someone stores durable food to face uncertain times. Beyond their nutritional value, dates also served an economic purpose. They were traded in markets, offered in religious rituals, and even used as gifts between families. This sweet fruit symbolized generosity and prosperity. Interestingly, in many cultures today, giving dates is still seen as a gesture of hospitality, as if this custom had survived for centuries. The palm tree also had a practical function beyond its fruit. Its leaves were used to weave baskets and coverings, while the trunk could be used in simple constructions. Nothing was wasted. This total utilization reminds us that when we look closely, even what seems limited can offer multiple solutions. It's simply a matter of vision and creativity. And so, among the dates, leaves, and trunks, the palm tree became a symbol of abundance. But it wasn't alone in this role. There was another plant that the farmer highly valued, not for its flavor, but for its usefulness. Papyrus, which grew on the banks of the Nile, had uses ranging from crafts to writing. On the banks of the Nile, a seemingly ordinary plant grew, but it concealed immense power, papyrus. Long before it was used as a writing medium, it was already part of the farmer's daily life. Its long, sturdy stems were harvested and transformed into practical objects, such as baskets for carrying grain or ropes for tying sheaves. The farmer knew that without this plant, his daily life would be much more difficult. Papyrus baskets were light, yet sturdy, ideal for transporting wheat, barley, and vegetables. One only had to look at a field after harvest to see women and children carrying these containers, filled to the brim. The simple act of braiding the fibers became an ingenious solution for transportation. It's curious how, to this day, we still use similar techniques in traditional crafts. Papyrus ropes were equally important. They tied together sheaves of wheat, held jars, and even served in small constructions. A material that originated from something as fragile as an aquatic plant, yet became essential in everyday life. This transformation reminds us that we often take simple resources for granted, when in fact they conceal great value. The use of papyrus also had a collective aspect. Groups would gather to harvest, cut, and prepare the fibers, creating a collaborative work routine. There, amid conversation and laughter, each piece of the plant took on a new form. It was almost a metaphor for life itself. When we come together, we can transform even what seems banal into something useful and lasting. So, while calloused hands braided papyrus fibers, little eyes learned by watching, because in Egypt, knowledge wasn't passed on just through words, but through daily examples. And it's precisely at this point that the tradition of teaching children to plant from an early age came into play. In ancient Egypt, learning didn't happen in classrooms with papyrus and teachers. The field was the true school, and parents were the teachers. From an early age, children were taken to watch the farm work, observing every gesture of their elders. They learned to use small hoes, water the plants, and even recognize the right time to plant or harvest. It was life showing, in practice, what books didn't yet exist to teach. This custom was not only a necessity, but also a tradition. Passing on agricultural knowledge to children ensured the continuity of the family and community. After all, without new farmers, there would be no future for Egypt. Today, we see something similar in families that teach values of responsibility early on, whether by caring for a pet or helping with small household chores. These are seeds planted in children's hearts. Parents knew the work shouldn't be too much for their children. Tasks were age appropriate, carrying small bundles of wheat, overseeing the gardens, or helping with grain sorting. This care fostered a sense of belonging, showing the children that they were already part of the productive cycle. It's like when a child helps prepare a simple dish, and in the end feels proud of having contributed to the family meal. Beyond technique, children learned values. Patience, discipline, and respect for nature were instilled in the silence of the fields. The simple act of waiting for a seed to germinate taught us about time and hope. This kind of lesson, even without words, shaped character, and if we think about it, many of us still carry memories of small gestures taught by our parents, which forever shaped our way of seeing the world. Agricultural training also strengthened family bonds. Alongside their parents, children not only learned to plant crops, but also shared stories, laughter, and even work songs. The fields became a space for communal living, where culture and affection were transmitted. It's as if each row of wheat was also a line of memory being written in the lives of those children. And so, over time, the children grew up ready to take their parents' place in the fields. But they also knew they weren't working just for themselves. A portion of the production would always be controlled and directed by the government, which established a strict system of oversight over surpluses. In ancient Egypt, farmers knew they didn't own everything they harvested. The government kept a close eye on agricultural surpluses, closely monitoring every grain that exceeded the family's basic needs. This surplus wasn't just food, it was power, wealth, and a guarantee of stability for the state. Farmers then worked knowing that part of their efforts supported much more than just their own household. Scribes and administrators were tasked with recording the numbers accurately. They walked through the granaries, noting the measurements and determining how much should be delivered to the pharaoh. There was no room for error or omission for the farmer. This constant presence was a reminder that his life was intertwined with the state machinery. It's like today, when all income must be declared and recorded in tax system. This strict control had a practical reason. The surplus stored by the state was used to feed workers on large construction projects, maintain armies, and even aid regions in times of drought. Thus, the farmer understood that his efforts were part of a collective project, but at the same time, he felt he would never fully enjoy the fruits of his labor. There was also an aspect of political power in this control. Whoever controlled the storehouses controlled the people's survival. Having reserves meant having authority, because in times of crisis, it was the government that distributed the resources. The farmer, no matter how hard he tried, knew that his security was always conditioned by the will of the government. This system, though rigid, sustained Egypt's grandeur. Without it, works like the pyramids and temples would not have been possible, as it was the agricultural surplus that fed thousands of workers. But for the common farmer, there was often only the hope that, after fulfilling his share, there would be enough left to live with dignity. And it was at this point that another collective strategy emerged. Community granaries, spaces where produce was stored to face times of famine, demonstrating that even in the face of state control, there were also local initiatives for protection. In ancient Egypt, folk wisdom already knew that not every year would be generous. Therefore, in addition to state-controlled storehouses, entire communities organized to build collective granaries. These spaces functioned as a kind of insurance against famine. Each family contributed a portion of the harvest, building reserves that could save lives in times of scarcity. Granaries were earthen structures, similar to silos, but for communal use. There, grain was carefully stored, protected from moisture and rodents. For the farmer, depositing part of his production in these granaries was more than an obligation. It was a way of investing in the collective future. After all, he knew that one day his own family might depend on this stock. This habit revealed an admirable sense of solidarity. Instead of thinking only of themselves, the farmer learned to look at the bigger picture. It was as if each grain saved was a silent promise of mutual aid. Today, we see reflections of this custom in agricultural cooperatives, food banks, and even community groups that organize to face times of crisis. The granaries were also spaces for communal living. Grain delivery and collection took place at times that brought the community together, strengthening bonds of trust. The farmer knew who contributed, who needed help, and who took care of maintenance. This transparency strengthened the sense of belonging and demonstrated that survival was a shared project. Beyond meeting basic needs, these collective stocks held symbolic value. They demonstrated that even in a hostile environment like the desert, humanity could create solutions for protection and abundance. It was proof that unity transformed fragility into strength, and perhaps this is the greatest lesson that has spanned the centuries. Together we face adversity better. And amidst this life of hard work and constant planning, the farmer still found space to alleviate the burden of routine. Often it was music, simple and repetitive, that filled the fields and made the effort less painful. In the intense heat of the Egyptian plains, work in the fields could seem endless. Hours of repetitive movements, the weight of the hoe, the sun beating down on the skin, everything conspired to turn the day into a burden. But there was a simple and powerful resource the farmers used to endure. Music, rhythmic songs rose from the fields like a collective breath, bringing lightness to the hardship. These songs weren't elaborate, but they had a cadence. The beat of the words accompanied the sound of the hoes, almost as if each blow to the ground were a musical note. The collective singing transformed the effort into a kind of sonic choreography. It's curious to think that at any time, human beings have found music as a way to escape fatigue. To this day, who hasn't put on a playlist to liven up the hard work? Besides alleviating monotony, the chants served to set the group's rhythm. When everyone sang together, the movement became more synchronized and productive. It was like rowing a boat together. The harmony of gestures reduced individual effort. This habit reminds us that often the secret to efficiency lies not just in strength, but in the harmony between people. The lyrics spoke of daily life, of the gods, of hope for good harvests. They were sung memories, passed down from generation to generation, that kept the people's identity alive. And the most fascinating thing is to see how this tradition echoes across so many cultures, from the work songs in the cotton fields to the folk songs that accompany household chores. Whenever life weighs on you, singing appears as a relief. The farmer also saw music as a way to teach. Children learned songs by watching adults and soon began repeating the verses. This way, the culture was preserved and the work became less solitary. It was the natural pedagogy of life, learning by singing while helping to plant. Anyone who has seen a child memorize songs before even learning to read understands the power of this resource. And at the end of the day, when the voices fell silent and the fields fell silent, fatigue remained, but so too did the shelter, simple and modest, where the farmer and his family found rest. These mud houses, though humble, were the heart of peasant life in Egypt. The Egyptian farmers' homes were simple but meaningful. Built with hand-molded, sun-dried mud bricks, they blended seamlessly into the desert landscape. There was no luxury, but there was functionality, thick walls that protected from the intense heat during the day and retained some warmth on cold nights. It was a modest shelter, but essential for the family's survival. These dwellings usually had only a few rooms, arranged in a practical manner. There was space for sleeping, storing utensils, and sometimes a small patio for cooking outdoors. There was no sophisticated furniture. Straw beds, mats, and clay jars were commonplace. It's curious how, amidst scarcity, life found ways to be light and straightforward. The building process involved the entire family. Men, women, and even children helped knead the clay with straw, shape the bricks, and build the walls. Each house was therefore the result of a collective effort, and this joint work strengthened bonds between relatives and neighbors. Today, in some rural villages, we still see this tradition alive, where the community comes together to build a house. Simplicity also had a symbolic side. While the pharaohs inhabited grand palaces and temples, the farmer found dignity in his small clay house. It was a stark contrast, but one that demonstrated the diversity of Egyptian society. For the farmer, the most important thing was not appearance, but the security of having a place to protect his family. Even though modest, these homes were full of life. There people cooked, told stories, learned to plant, and even kept small altars dedicated to household gods. It was within these walls that everyday culture was preserved, hidden from official records. It's interesting to think that while the monuments impressed the world, it was in these simple little houses that the true soul of Egypt pulsed. And within these households, there were also subtle differences between those who lived as free farmers and those who worked on lands belonging to temples or authorities. This social distinction profoundly shaped rural life, demonstrating that not all farmers shared the same freedom. In ancient Egypt, not all farmers enjoyed the same conditions. There were the free, who cultivated their own land or small rented plots, and there were the serfs, who were tied to temples or the pharaoh's estates. For the former, despite the heavy burden of taxes, there was a sense of autonomy. Serfs, on the other hand, lived under strict rules, working directly for religious institutions or the state. The free farmer could decide, albeit with limitations, the fate of part of his harvest. He could exchange grain at the market, save it for his family, or even offer it in ritual. The serf, on the other hand, had little or no control. What he produced was delivered to the temple or administrators, who then distributed it according to need. It was as if they lived in parallel worlds, even though they inhabited the same field. This difference was also reflected in social status. The free farmer was viewed with greater respect, as he enjoyed a modicum of independence. The serf, on the other hand, was associated with constant obligation, his life revolving around duty. Interestingly, this distinction recalls the modern differences between entrepreneurs and those who work under rigid contracts. Both produce, but the perception of freedom is distinct. However, it's important to emphasize that none of them completely escaped state control. Even the free farmer had to report to the scribes and pay taxes. Freedom, in this context, was relative, but it still meant being able to dream of a little more abundance or choice over one's own future. This division demonstrated how religion was also intertwined with the economy. Temples were not just places of worship, but veritable administrative centers, controlling land, labor, and crops. The servants attached to them supported not only the priests, but also the great rituals that maintained Egypt's symbolic order. It's fascinating to note how inseparably faith and work were linked, and in the end, both free and serfs shared a common destiny. They all supported the basis of the Egyptian economy, agriculture. Without the sweat of these men and women, there would be no pyramids, temples, or armies. And it is precisely at this point that the true relevance of agriculture to ancient Egypt is revealed as the pillar that supported the entire civilization. In ancient Egypt, everything began and ended with agriculture. It was not just an economic activity, but the foundation upon which the entire society was built. Without the fertile fields along the banks of the Nile, there would be no food for families, no resources for temples, much less to sustain armies and build grand monuments. Agriculture was the invisible engine that drove the empire. Taxes paid in grain kept the state running. Stored reserves ensured food was supplied to workers on major projects, like the pyramids and temples. Even international trade relied on agricultural surpluses, which were exchanged for timber, metals, and other resources. Egypt, like each harvest, therefore, had an impact that transcended the village and spread throughout the kingdom. It's curious to note how even religion was connected to agriculture. Gods were invoked to protect the fields, and entire rituals revolved around the harvest. Abundance was seen as a sign of blessing, and scarcity as punishment. This spiritual connection reinforced the idea that planting and harvesting were not only practical activities, but also sacred, elevating the farmer to a position of symbolic importance. While agriculture was so important that even social organization reflected this centrality. Scribes, priests, and rulers lived off what grew from the land. The pharaoh might be seen as a living god, but even he depended on the anonymous labor of farmers to maintain his throne. This shows how, deep down, Egypt's true strength came from below, from the calloused hands that worked under the sun. This total dependence on the countryside taught a lesson in humility. No matter how grand the civilization, its stability was tied to the water cycle and the silent efforts of those who planted. It's as if all the wealth, the palaces, and the military conquests were nothing more than a reflection of the simplicity of the fertile land. Without it, nothing would survive. And so, amidst the floods of the Nile, wooden hoes, and clay silos, the foundation of one of the greatest civilizations in history was formed and developed. Agriculture wasn't just work, it was life, it was faith, it was economics, and it was power. And this power, in the hands of the people, continues to resonate to this day, as a reminder that everything we build still ultimately depends on the land. And after exploring every detail of a farmer's life in ancient Egypt, you might have realized that the greatness of a civilization isn't measured solely by its monuments, but by the silent efforts of those who sustain it all. Ultimately, their story isn't so different from ours. We still depend on cycles, repetitive labor, and the patience to wait for the fruits to appear. But the question remains, what are you growing today? Are you investing time and energy in something that will actually yield a harvest later, or are you letting your seeds die from lack of care? Think about it carefully, because just like in Egypt, abundance doesn't come by chance, but through daily effort. And if even in the middle of the desert it was possible to transform mud into prosperity, what can you also transform in your life? Maybe you just lack discipline, maybe you lack long-term vision, or perhaps you just lack the belief that yes, the harvest can be greater than you imagine. Now, I want to challenge you. What is your fertile ground today? What can you start planting even if it seems small, but that in a few years will be the foundation of your own prosperity? Leave your answer in the comments, because sharing experiences can inspire many who are reading. And of course, if you want to continue learning and reflecting with me on stories that seem distant but have everything to do with our lives, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss any future video.